So today we're having a live discussion on the 3 big wake-up calls for boards from 2020. And today's discussion definitely will be jam-packed with interesting insights. Our objective here is to provide, practical takeaways and insights that you can apply in your own institutions and companies. Before we dive in, just some housekeeping to get everyone level set. Please get your questions ready. Use the Zoom chat box to do so, and we'll be monitoring these throughout the conversation, adding them in throughout the conversation. We will have a dedicated Q&A towards the end. If you have any technical questions or difficulties with connecting, unfortunately, none of the speakers here can help you, but we do have a team on the back end who can. So just use Zoom or email us at marketing@datamaran.com and we'll do our best to facilitate. If we have technical difficulties, please bear with us. We'll do our best to rectify as quickly as possible. And the event is being recorded. So we will distribute a recording of the event after the fact. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Zoom, there is a Q&A box that you can use for those questions, and we can monitor those. So let's move on. I'm excited today to be joined by a variety of different experts on this subject who come from corporate backgrounds, now sitting within executive positions at companies, board positions, having worked with a variety of different industries. Firstly, my name is Susie Kadis. I'm VP of Brand and Business Development at Datamaran, hosting this event today. And with me, I have Paul Washington, who is the Executive Director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board, our partner on the publication that actually coincides with this event. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning. Hi.
Hi. Also joined by Steve Gottsfield, who is an Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability and External Affairs Officer at Newmont Mining Corporation. Hi, Steve.
Good morning, good afternoon.
And Elaine Dorwood-King, who is a non-executive director on various companies, so can bring a wealth of expertise there. Hi, good morning, Elaine.
Good morning, good to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining. And Byron Laughlin, who is Global Head of Board Engagement at NASDAQ.
Thank you,
Byron.
Suzanne. Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Yes, very excited about the discussion for today. We had some time to talk through what we'd like to achieve. So just to kick it off, why are we here? I think we can all agree that 2020 has been an interesting year. For many people, it's been, I think, a tipping point when it comes to understanding and reevaluating, what are actual risks to businesses today, and what are sort of the external events and external risks that we as companies and corporate leaders really need to keep top of mind as we look towards the future. In terms of thinking about, not just economic viability, but also an ability to, maintain the well-being of our employees, an ability to meet rising investor and regulatory expectations for more information about how, as corporate leaders, we're taking into consideration things like social injustice, climate change, public health. And those are 3 areas that we've explored together with the Conference Board in a new Global Insights report, the 3 big wake-up calls for boards. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we found through that research. And then we'll go into an open discussion with everybody to think about, as a company, how can you take a renewed look at your risk management processes and disclosures when it comes to external and ESG risks? And ESG, I realize that's an abbreviation some may not be familiar with. So here we're talking about things that relate to environmental issues like climate change, social and governance issues like diversity and inclusion. And we'll go a little bit more into that. We'll also talk about the importance of having a more dynamic and data-driven approach to materiality in order to really effectively address these different types of emerging and systemic risks. And then we'll also think about, how do you ensure sufficient board oversight of these issues? as expectations from key stakeholders like investors and regulators rise when it comes to having board oversight of these. So who is Datamaran? A very quick introduction. Why are we here? Why are we hosting a discussion like this for those of you who may not know us? So we are a software analytics platform that helps companies identify and monitor external risks and opportunities in the broader landscape. Using our patented technology, we look at, how are companies reporting on these issues? What are the issues that are popping up in regulation? How are these issues being framed in the media? And we work with a variety of companies across industries who use the insights to inform materiality, but also ongoing external risk analysis. So for us, it's really important to, be able to take the insights that these companies are using to inform their strategy, but also share them with the wider public. And we're thrilled to have done so in collaboration with the conference board for the publication that we're launching for today. And what we're seeing, just based on the work that we do with these different companies is that really today there's an interest in strengthening and aligning key business processes, risk management, board oversight, and annual reporting and disclosure. How do we make those processes more systematic? How do we make them more aligned? How do you bring, the different types of expertise necessary to consider traditional financial risks, but also these emerging and systemic risks, and have a cohesive strategy as a company? And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So, I don't think I have to go too deep into this, but here are just some headlines from, recent media. And what these headlines speak to is, the fact that, as we had already mentioned, there are more pressure on companies really to be more transparent about what they're doing around these types of risks and opportunities. Investors and regulators are asking for more information to be disclosed more consistently in different types of reports, not just standalone sustainability reports, but also increasingly within regulatory filings and financial filings. And what we're seeing is that is also causing, an internal discussion at companies around who is really responsible for overseeing those types of processes and ensuring that they are systematic and they are robust and they are consistent. And of course, a lot of companies have ESG experts, sustainability experts within their teams that have probably been looking at these issues for a very long time. And as these issues have become more elevated in importance, we're starting to see other types of individuals within companies getting on board, general counsels, CFOs. And we're in this transition moment right now. So we have to think about, how, as a company, how can we really maximize our ability to use the different expertise we have internally to more successfully look at these issues and integrate them into our business strategy. And a key component there, as we've mentioned already, is disclosure. This is how companies can communicate what their strategy is. This is how companies can communicate, their awareness of what risks and opportunities lie ahead. And more, we're seeing, that investors in particular are placing more scrutiny on what is being disclosed within this self-reported information, particularly this past year, right, as we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement. And fortunately, many companies and CEOs coming out with strong positions on diversity, equity, inclusion. And now it's about consistency, ensuring that, you're following through on those commitments made and that you're continuing to share your story on how you're doing that within your self-reported information. So with that, I am going to actually invite Paul Washington to tell us a little bit more about this publication that we've been working on together. But before we do that, we actually want to ask you, the audience, some questions. So we have some polls throughout the conversation to get your opinion. And the first poll that we just wanted to ask you, or question we wanted to ask you is, in 2020, which issue has most elevated the importance of ESG-related risks internally at your company? The three options we have, you should see those on your screen, are COVID-19 or public health broadly. The second is climate change, and the third is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, there might be a combination of those, but we're just curious if there's one in particular. All right, I see responses coming in. Okay, so it looks like it's relatively even distribution across the board, but COVID-19 and public health really seems to be the driver here, perhaps unsurprisingly. Obviously, public health touches upon the other two issues as well. So thanks for contributing your responses there. All right, so Paul, these are the three issues, that we investigated together for the joint publication, 3 big wake-up calls for boards. I'm wondering, if you could just speak a little bit more about, why is it important to provide these types of insights now, and what did we find?
Sure. I think what we're seeing in these 3 areas, obviously, is because of the incidents of 2020, there's been a focus on these environmental and social issues. Until now, the focus on those areas has largely been driven by call them hydraulic forces, increasing concern about climate change, concern about economic inequality, a focus on companies rather than governments often taking the lead in these areas. But 2020 has been a watershed moment. So those sort of long-term hydraulic forces have suddenly met the accelerant of the pandemic, of the connection between the social impact of the pandemic and the diversity aspect of it, disadvantaged communities being hurt disproportionately. And obviously the racial unrest, not only in the US, but frankly, in many places around the world. So I think you're seeing a greater focus by investors and by companies on these issues. So what we wanted to do with this report, and I don't know if you want to flip to the next slide, what we wanted to do with this report is to take a look at what companies are disclosing to the world. Now, this is not what companies include in, we looked at their financial disclosures in the S&P 250 and the European 350. And, financial disclosures are not a perfect measure for what's going on inside a company because obviously there are different disclosure regimes, right? But what you put in your financial disclosures is a good indicator of how companies are moving these ESG issues, these 3 in particular, into the mainstream. We know that investors have moved ESG into the mainstream. We know that inside companies, it's moving into the mainstream. Disclosure is somewhat lagging in some cases, but it does give a sense of what's happening with inside companies. And here are some of the three findings that we came across. And let me start with climate risk. And I'm actually going to do this as a little bit of a glass half full rather than the glass empty. When it came to climate, we found that 90% of European companies and 70% of US companies do include climate risks in their financial disclosures. So that's actually good, but that still leaves a gap. And we're finding that, frankly, a lot of those climate risk disclosures are kind of one-liners. And clearly that suggests that there's more to be done on the disclosure side and maybe within companies and looking at really how does climate affect your company, especially if you're not an energy company, right? Or you're not an extractive company. Every company is affected by climate. So really there's a need to delve more deeply there. On DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, there we found that nearly all European companies, but about 2/3 of US companies we looked at include DEI and information in their in their financial reports. We expect that to increase significantly, particularly in the US in light of SEC regulations. So there's definitely more to come there. The third thing, which is the top point here, which is really quite striking, which is that there was a lack of disclosure worldwide when it came to public health risks. Now, this is, to some extent, it's understandable. Because what we faced with the pandemic was unprecedented in its scale. However, it's not the first time companies have considered pandemics. I mean, I know when I was at Time Warner for 20 years, we looked at SARS, because we thought that SARS, had it spread, could shut down movie theaters, right? And so we owned Warner Brothers Studio, and that was a significant impact. So I think that suggests that companies need to be mindful of not only what's currently happening, but what has happened in the past and is likely to happen in the future in areas that, again, may not be directly related to your business model, but are external systemic risks like those in public health that can have, in fact, an extraordinary impact on your business. So those were the three kind of key findings. Hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, this is, a sort of an evolution, and we expect to see definitely uptake around these three areas in the next year. So, something that we'll be actively monitoring together and digging into, in different ways. Looking at, how our companies responding, the regulatory landscape is supposed to potentially change in the US, especially when it comes to disclosure in the next year. So, there are a lot of different influences to your point about why these issues are important now.
Yeah, and I would just say that when we've conducted research in this area, what's driving the increase in disclosure is actually, to some extent, it's driven by regulations, but largely it's being driven by investor expectations and by those of other stakeholders. I mean, that's really the engine, because often regulation just sets the floor, but it's investors who are really setting the bar.
Absolutely. And also, if you think about from a company position, if you wait for the regulation to come into play, that tends to be a pretty slow process. So then it would be a reactive approach versus a more proactive approach.
And it's also in companies' interest to seize the moment now, because if you're expecting increased regulation, go out and give it your best shot, because the better disclosure you have right now, and the better internal processes you have right now, which we can get into, but the better disclosure you have right now, there's a better shot that the regulations will support and conform to that industry standard rather than radically shift it. Because if you're just waiting there and you're not doing much, then you are not actually helping to do as much as you can to set the standards that the regulators can then turn to and say, yes, this is what companies can do, and this is what's realistic.
Absolutely. You brought up a good point. There are signals out there already from investors, from the public, from these, softer voluntary frameworks, guidelines, policies. So, be tuned into those signals, because they're there.
Very much so.
And getting louder.
Yes. And frankly, the one thing I'd say, those external reporting frameworks, we are seeing a convergence of those frameworks.
We are.
But that itself is going to take time. And even as we're seeing convergence, we've done a recent analysis of DE&I reporting requirements. They are different across all of the major frameworks. So companies still, you cannot wait either for regulation or for the nirvana of consistent external reporting frameworks from SASB and others. You've got to grapple with this now.
Absolutely. Yeah, companies need to take ownership of that process. And that's part of what we also, in the report, we have insights, we have data. So definitely take a look when we send that to you after the report that speak to not only these disclosure trends, but also some of those policy and regulatory trends. And just thinking about what's ahead, to summarize this in 3 points definitely was a challenge, but we did our best. And, I think to reiterate what you said, Paul, now is the time for companies to examine whether their financial disclosures adequately acknowledge these types of systemic risks as these expectations rise. And to your point, disclosure is a reflection of the process that you have internally as a company. So we'll talk a bit more about that process. But also to your point about climate change and the data that we show in this report, it's important not to make broad statements. You have to provide specifics when you can. And that also gets to the final point about that process, right? What we see is, materiality and the issues that might be important for your company today, that's dynamic and can change very dramatically, as we've seen in 2020.
And if you don't mind, let me just pick up on that last point, because it's one of the reasons why we were so delighted at the conference board to collaborate with Datamaran on this, because you're really the leader when it comes to doing dynamic materiality assessments. On the one hand, companies have often done their materiality assessment of ESG issues or sustainability issues every 3 to 5 years, which you understand. These are long-term issues. You want to set long-term goals. You don't want to change the goalposts every year. Your financial reporting cycle tends to be, we do a deep dive on risks every year. Okay, so those are all fine. Having said that, the world's moving a lot faster, right? And so even if you say these are our big ESG issues, and even you say, here's what we're doing on an annual basis in terms of a risk disclosure, at the very minimum, in managing your business, you need to have your finger on the pulse. So you need to do dynamic materiality assessments. Now, those should then cascade through to your financial reporting and so forth. But even if you're not thinking about putting this out there, you need dynamic materiality assessments just to run your business.
Absolutely. It's about awareness, to your point.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Paul. For everyone on the webinar, we'll distribute an advanced copy of this report after the webinar. It officially goes live tomorrow. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to move into really conversation. We've had the conversation, Paul, but now we're going to move on to a conversation with Steve. You're in the thick of it. Let's say you're in the hot seat, you're at a company, leading on these processes, having to deal with investor demands, having to deal with changing processes. And Newmont really has been for a long time, about 20 years now, already actively disclosing information on these types of risks and opportunities. I'm curious, in light of the intensifying interest and change in expectations you're seeing from investors, for instance, how is Newmont adjusting its risk management and disclosure approach right now? What changes are you going through?
Well, thank you, Susie. And I have to say a lot of what you and Paul were just discussing, of course, really resonates with us. So your question is quite timely. We're adjusting to this increased interest by monitoring global momentum, strengthening our internal collaboration across our financial and non-financial risk and reporting teams, and laying the groundwork for a more integrated approach to financial and sustainability risk and reporting. So as you were just indicating, for Newmont, our sustainability reporting dates back to the early 2000s, basically because we were getting feedback from investors and stakeholders expressing concern that really key stakeholders and investors were not looking for, they were looking for more information on our environmental and social performance than would typically be provided in an SEC filing. So what started as a series of reports on our community relationships led to Beyond the Mine, which is our global annual sustainability and enterprise-wide annual sustainability report. So today, this report is now 200 plus pages, and it aligns with GRI standards, SASB standards, TCFD guidelines, and a host of other reporting guidelines. In fact, we were recently recognized as the second most transparent reporter in the S&P 500, as measured by Bloomberg ESG Disclosure, which is something we're really proud about. I think what we're observing is that some of the traditionally non-financial risks in disclosures, such as human capital management, have become so significant from a sustainability or ESG perspective that we are seeing increased disclosure requirements in regulatory filings. Obviously, we've been watching the EU regulatory space and listening very closely to our investors. And it's not unreasonable to expect the August 2020 updates to the US SEC SK filings, discussing human capital management strategy and other traditionally non-financial aspects of the business to be just the beginning of similar risk and disclosure trends here in the US. Our work to determine what is material from sustainability or ESG perspective helps us manage sustainability risk robustly and to direct resources and prepare strategies for the longer run. It also positions us well to ensure that our investors and stakeholders have the information available to them that they require for their ESG screenings and provides us with the ability to respond to regulatory change and new reporting requirements more quickly. Just taking a step back, it was not so long ago that the value proposition of public companies was discussed almost exclusively in the lens of shareholder financial value. I think we all recognize that that mark has moved squarely to the concept of stakeholder value and longer-term value proposition through the lens of sustainability primarily. Companies are expected to have a purpose beyond the balance sheet. For us, ours is to create value and improve lives through sustainable and responsible mining. We have seen an increased interest in understanding the non-financial impacts of companies and the broader role corporations are expected to play. And with this expectation, a demand for robust sustainability data. So for this reason, we disclose issues and trends in our annual sustainability report that are significant to our stakeholders, but may not necessarily be financially material today. So what our local hiring rates look like, what our community investment spend looks like, whether we are responding timely to complaints and grievances, if those metrics were to change one way or the other in a given year, it's not financially material, but the trend and commitment to improve along with the transparent reporting on our progress is meaningful to other stakeholders and frankly, an increasingly number of ESG focused investors. Our sustainability issues mapping exercise, it's what we call our materiality assessment process, is distinct from our financial impact analysis. For our sustainability report, we incorporate the stakeholder perspective on which issues are most likely to influence stakeholders' opinion of or decisions about Newmont. Not just the investor perspective, but all stakeholders who have the ability to impact or be impacted by Newmont's operations. To do this, we follow GRI principles of determining materiality, which that process is externally assured. And we use the SASB sector materiality map. So it's a bit of a hybrid approach. While our approach to identifying material risks from a financial perspective and materiality from a sustainability mapping perspective are different, they can be leveraged to more robustly inform our overall understanding of risk, both in the short and longer term. We are focused on tracking the dynamic nature of sustainability risk and watching how it can move quickly to something that is financially material and essential to our investors. And I guess I'd say as a final point, one challenge is navigating, and I heard you all just touch on this, the proliferation of reporting guidelines, standards, and rating organizations. Frankly, this is difficult for companies because of the resources needed to respond and is not necessarily helpful to stakeholders or investors due to the lack of global comparability of sustainability disclosures that provide decision useful information. We're hopeful that over time there will be a consolidation in this space as it's going to provide more consistency and comparability and reporting and better overall understanding of sustainability and risk.
Yeah, that's great. And you brought up some important points there, right? There are inherent differences in some of the processes, but there's a convergence taking place right now, especially when it comes to that concept of materiality. And, we're not going to get into the idea of double materiality. That's for a different conversation, have some thinkings on that. But, you brought up a good point as well about it, you wanting to be proactive and wanting to have your finger on the pulse. And in light of, diversity, equity, and inclusion and the attention that's been focused there, have you seen, how has your approach, this changing and evolving and dynamic approach to risk management, to disclosure, when it comes to D&I, do you have any specific examples there that you'd like to speak to?
Sure. So, first let me say that, not only does a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion help us attract and retain top talent, really from the broadest talent pool But fundamentally, we believe that there are at least 3 key benefits of an inclusive culture with a commitment to equity and diversity. We make better and richer decisions. We can identify and manage risk better, and we avoid or better manage unintended consequences. So we know that when we create a sense of belonging for everyone and not just a few, our employees are more willing to speak up. They are less afraid of uncomfortable discussions or conflict because they know we value diversity of thought and experience, and that creates a psychologically safe environment. So from our perspective, a speak up culture is critical in order to ensure that risks are identified, discussed, and considered if they are to be most effectively managed or avoided. We believe this to be true at the board level and throughout the organization, setting the tone at the top. I'm proud to mention that Newmont achieved gender parity amongst its non-executive directors earlier this year. And while this is a significant milestone, we have to recognize that we have a way to go to meet parity goals broadly throughout the company. Newmont has included disclosure of workplace inclusion and diversity in its sustainability report for many years, primarily focusing on gender. In our 2019 annual sustainability report, we have 2 full pages dedicated to workplace, including our approach to human capital strategy, labor relations, talent management, diversity, equity, and inclusion, including our commitment to Paradigm for Parity framework and the UN Sustainability Development Goal to achieve gender equality. And then, of course, we have 7 full pages of appendix of detailed workforce diversity training and labor data in accordance with the GRI reporting standards. But on the events of 2020, as you also were alluding to earlier with the Black Lives Matter movement, we are considering how to further broaden the equity disclosure to include a focus on racial equity, which we have not done. For purposes of the sustainability report, we provide the framework data that might be relevant to stakeholders, even though it does not rise to a materiality level for financial reporting purposes. Examples would be employee demographics by gender, broken down by country or employee category, or employee turnover by gender and initiation date and region. By contrast, we historically had not included disclosure on any of these items in the annual report filed with the SEC. The focus there on those disclosures has been limited to employee and contractor headcount and potential financially significant risk areas like labor relation matters, union negotiations or strikes, which could impact the operations. So now with the SEC rules, we expect to include more information and we'll be speaking to our human capital strategy in the business section of the annual report for the first time.
That's great. Yeah. And it just speaks to, it's such a specific, palpable example, I think, for most companies today that speaks to that dynamic nature of this fast changing landscape around ESG risks and opportunities. And, you mentioned that you want to keep a finger on the pulse, and you are taking a dynamic and data-driven approach to materiality, particularly using Datamaran's patented technology to do so. Why is that important for you right now?
So over the past few years, we've expanded the scope and reach of our sustainability reporting issues identification as part of the overall materiality assessment process that I talked about earlier. What was traditionally thought of as a sustainability and external relations exercise, I guess, has now brought into a very comprehensive approach that includes the members of our board, senior executives and functional leaders from across all key areas of the business, and incorporates stakeholder feedback from our top investors, our global NGOs, academia, and industry association leaders. So while this process has been effective and I think perceived well by external rating agencies, frankly, we recognize that we were not fully utilizing technology to assist us in the sustainability mapping process. So this year, we went further by using Datamaran, and this is our first year doing this, which has the capacity to assess thousands of data points on potentially material ESG issues relevant to us, which we can then assess and analyze as part of our process. So although 2020, will be the first year using this tool, the Datamaran system has helped us to cast a wider net in how we're capturing potentially material issues and societal signals that can gain momentum quickly. So while I'm sure we'll continue to seek input from our external stakeholders and from internal leadership, whether at the site or the board level, Datamaran's big data capabilities process should help us to evaluate external issues and trends in a way that reduces the potential for unconscious bias and further ensure that no materiality issue has been mischaracterized or overlooked in our mapping or risk process.
Great. Yeah, unconscious bias, that's a key one, right? Objectivity is hard, and that's where data can play a role. Thank you. Just to the audience, I do see your questions coming through. I'm responding to some of them. I'm saving some of them to respond to in the next discussion piece. So thanks so much, Steve, for sharing your viewpoints. Before we go into the broader discussion with the group and speak more to the board engagement perspective, curious to hear from the audience. We've got another question for you. So we're going to pop up that poll momentarily. All right. There we go. That's still poll 1. No, sorry. It says number 1. This is the second question. So the question is your company taking a renewed look at its risk disclosures to include ESG information? I'll give you a moment to respond there. Okay. A lot of responses rolling in. Great. So yes, the large majority are saying yes, they are currently, or their companies are currently taking a renewed look at their risk disclosures to include ESG information. Good to hear. So, with that, obviously, this process, Steve already spoke to it, involves, not just the people in executive management or, people in the weeds doing that actual materiality and reporting process, but it also involves the board. We've seen that the competencies in the board in particular, expectations of competencies are really evolving. And that's a question we actually had from one of the participants, talking about the complexity of these issues and what advice the panel might have to ensure that boards can draw better on the skills of people trained in this crucial discipline. So with that said, Elaine, you sit on various boards, you have expertise in this field. I'm curious, what are you seeing in terms of how the dynamics within the board are changing?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. It's great to be here this afternoon. Well, I think boards are being forced to be more rigorous about how they pay attention to the range of environmental and social matters. Many companies have instinctively thought they were doing the right thing and trying to drive the right culture and values, but they weren't really measuring how well they were doing on some of those things. So what I've seen is boards recognizing they need to take these kinds of emerging or systematic risks more seriously, and then looking at their management team and how that's being implemented. What are the skill sets around the board table? How does the board address these issues? Most of the companies that I'm aware of in the extractive sector and in industrial infrastructure are moving to put committees in place that are charged to specifically scrutinize and have oversight across the ESG range. And so I'm on 4 large publicly listed companies now, and 2 of those have added these committees in the last year. So no longer being content to have those risks just looked at the board level or by the audit and risk committee, but wanting to have a committee that has the scope and the terms of reference to take a deeper dive across some of these issues that you raised earlier, whether it's climate change or public health, or in fact, the equity, diversity, and inclusion question.
Great. it's good to see that that change is actually happening. And, you know, one of the drivers of change are, you know, influencers like stock exchanges, like NASDAQ. And Byron, recently, NASDAQ just made a proposal for a new listing rule related to board diversity. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And, you know, why now? How is that being received? And you'll just have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Suzanne. And it's a pleasure being here with you all and talking through these issues. So the disclosure listing rule, and I'll emphasize it's about disclosure, because for those that think that we're trying to tell the business world how to do their job, that's not the purpose of this. And to my colleagues' favor, and particularly something Stephen said, you know, COVID has tested much this year of what we do and what we're talking about, and particularly the impact that we're having on society in these areas that E, S, and G all touch. And the speed of information, that's what accelerated what happened post George Floyd. The accuracy of information is something that's of great concern to all of us. And this is part of what this gets into, is that there would be, you know, around this discussion of materiality and thresholds of disclosure, that we'd be receiving and disclosing accurate information. Part of this was that the investor would clearly know, all investors would know who is running their companies, who is the board of directors guiding the company over the long term of their existence. And so that was a key part of the disclosure rule. It's also that someone like an exchange can encourage, along with our constituency. This just didn't happen on a whim. There were many senior influencers on both the investor community side and on the CEO and board side weighing in to help facilitate this move. And we need support and debate in the public marketplace, because this is a recommendation and we have to go through SEC approval. And so comment letters are welcomed on this. So that's the initial part of it. And I'll let you ask more questions.
You brought up a good point about the dialogue, right? And it's important that this was created out of a dialogue, excuse me, with, you know, corporate executives, board members, as well as investors. And I think, you know, we're starting to see that there's just much more dialogue amongst those individuals around these types of issues. And that gets us to, you know, the role of the CFO and the changing role of the CFO within a company. And Paul, I know that the conference board has been looking at some trends around board engagement, CFO engagement on these issues. You know, what are some of the things that you've seen recently?
Sure. I'll start with the CFO, which if you don't have your CFO on board on any of this, you're in serious trouble, right? And so CFOs are increasingly stepping into a leadership role. Let me talk about the ways that they really can and are bringing sustainability into the process. First of all, they're bringing sustainability into the strategic planning and budgeting processes, which are often run by or in conjunction with the CFO. And so they are considering, as part of those processes, you know, what are the risks, and importantly, what are the opportunities in the area of sustainability? So that's absolutely key. CFOs also play a critical role in disclosure. Either they or your securities lawyers, they're working together to run your disclosure process. And so CFOs play an absolutely critical role in making sure that sustainability issues get built into the processes that you're driving for disclosure. But other areas too, M&A opportunities. CFOs are increasingly open to having sustainability measures factored into your decision-making process. Okay, are you buying a company that actually has good DE&I metrics? Are you buying a company that's got good human rights? So part of the due diligence process, part of your screening criteria for doing M&A can be built in there. The only other thing I'd add is that the CFO is critical, but if people are thinking about trying to get your finance function on board, look for other areas as well. Your treasurer, improving your sustainability side can lower your cost of capital. It can give you access to green bonds and things like that. Your CFO is important, but look for other areas. And then the final thing I'd note with this whole thing is that finance needs to learn to speak sustainability, and sustainability is learning to speak finance. One way that is happening is we are increasingly seeing executives who are doing a tour of duty from finance and going into sustainability and vice versa. That tour of duty is very important. And I would just end by going to the board question, which is the more you as management loop in your CFO and do all of that, the better chance you have of staying ahead of your board on sustainability issues. What we're often seeing is boards are ahead of management on sustainability. They're asking questions. They serve on other boards. They're coming back. That's not an ideal situation for the board. So work with your general counsel, work with your CFO, get ahead of it, and then present a plan to the board for addressing these sustainability issues so that you're not caught flat-footed when they come and say, well, company X where I serve on the board is doing this. Why aren't you?
Absolutely. And I see some head nodding over there from Steve, and Steve, I know you were also in the general counsel seat previously. So curious, how you see that happening now at Newmont. Does that resonate?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that, it's integral to us. And of course, Elaine was in the seat that I have now back then, and we work closely together as well. But maybe I can talk a little bit about Newmont's board engagement and the way in which we deal with ESG risks here. Newmont's board is deeply engaged on ESG matters, and oversight of key ESG risk topics is really considered at the full board level, in addition to leveraging our 4 committees to assist by assigning certain risk oversight areas to specific committees. So the chairs of each committee report out to the full board after each quarterly meeting to ensure that the board is kept apprised of what committees have reviewed. By way of example, and Elaine was talking about the number of boards that she's on and the creation of some of these specific committees. We have a safety and sustainability committee, which we've had for many years, and it conducts quarterly reviews of the company's sustainability performance on issues such as safety, health, security performance, environmental performance and management, human rights, cultural heritage management, biodiversity, community relationships issues. We are very fortunate to have an ESG expert serve as the chair of this committee, in Jane Nelson, who has spent much of her career advising and advocating for sustainable business practices as the founding director of Harvard's Corporate Responsibility Initiative. So having directors with the right backgrounds is incredibly helpful to management as well. And we also monitor emerging issues and report out to the committee on more significant sustainability risks facing the company, as well as the strategies for addressing them. So, for example, the Safety and Sustainability Committee and our board were actively involved in supporting our recently announced greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets by 30% by 2030, and our goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And then finally, I just say that the directors in the Safety and Sustainability Committee are also key stakeholders in reviewing and providing input on our annual materiality assessment and then, of course, our annual sustainability report.
And Susie, if I might, one of the challenges, because some companies can put a lot of this in one committee, but often there will be topics that will be spread across multiple committees. And so let's take diversity, equity, and inclusion. You may take your compensation committee, expand it to be your HR committee or something, but still your audit committee and compliance still will have a role over that. Nominating governance when it comes to certainly sometimes senior level C's, succession or reputation management, shareholder proposals, that committee is going to be involved. So it's really important for a couple of things. First, companies need to be very clear in their charters what committees have what responsibility. The second thing is companies have so many levers in this area. Take diversity, promotions, compensation, their compliance programs, a whole array of of levers that they have to move DE&I, it's extra work for management to make sure that the company is moving all of those levers in the direction of their human capital strategy and the business strategy. You can't have one committee pulling this way, another committee pulling that way. So it's both allocation among the committees, and then as you have your strategy and implement, really make sure that the levers are being pulled in the same direction. It's hard.
Yeah, I would
Elaine,
agree
please.
with that. The committees need to work together. I mean, I'm chairing 2 safety and sustainability committees, but I work very closely, with the chairs of the compensation or the Com and Gov committees to make sure that, for example, compensation is aligned. And that was another thing I wanted to mention with regard to what changes I see in boards is a much more focus on how do they tie not just the CEO's compensation, but the executive team's compensation to delivery of the key material, social, and environmental aspects. And you can do that. I think companies have been afraid to do that for some time, beyond things that are so easily measurable, such as safety. But now I'm seeing more and more companies that are willing to take longer term looks at what they need to do for all of their stakeholders across the social space as well as the environmental space, and make those tangible, make those more than 5 or 10%, make it 25% of compensation tied to that whole ESG framework. And to do that effectively, of course, you have to measure things, you have to have the data, and you have to set targets that people understand, what the priorities are. And we're seeing more and more of that.
And sometimes if you miss on something, it may not just be losing that 5 or 10%. Boards have that discretion to say, we're going to slam you. We had this at Time Warner where we slammed a senior executive by about 30% of their bonus because they just didn't do a good job on diversity, equity, and inclusion for a couple of years in a row. So even though it was only 3% actually of their total bonus, numerically, boom, boards can use their discretion negatively and positively, but negatively too, to send a very strong message here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
that's one of the tricky things for this year as well, is how do you factor in the COVID complexity into the compensation package?
Yeah, that's a different webcast, but you're right.
Yeah. And then that gets into business continuity planning generally, Elaine, right? Which, is an issue we also explore in the report. How are companies approaching business continuity, and is, that's something that needs to be revisited? Likely, yes, as we've seen in 2020, but the point you're bringing about compensation is important because it reinforces that there are financial risks and opportunities tied to these issues. And that, I think they tend to be sort of bucketed in these separate ESG spheres where it's, about reputation and the link to financial risk and opportunity hasn't been as clear. But, I think no one can walk away from the fact that that's actual, as we've seen in 2020. Great. I've seen there are quite a few questions coming in, some of which are really specific. So, I think I'll share those, the very specific ones, because that might require a little bit too much detail. But there was a question here, thinking about, and this is something we explore in the report, differences between, what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States. And Byron, I know NASDAQ, has activity, lots of activity in the EU as well when it comes to promoting ESG integration. So I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit, to some of those differences that you're seeing in terms of corporate appetite to be more proactive or more transparent about ESG risks, and if you see that trickling down here more in the US these days as well.
Well, if we highlight what Stephen just outlined, I think that's a good example of the trend we're seeing in the United States. Now, I will say my primary work is around board evaluation, performance evaluation. That's where I spend most of my time working with chairs and CEOs around that. And the trends I'm seeing is, one, ESG committees or some relationship that's helping connect the dots, as Elaine described, around the various committees, particularly for a company that has several committees, and that there's been this ignition of thought around there's ESG disclosure, and then in the boardroom, there's a lot of ESG discussion around how do we capitalize on this shift in society? How do we see this as a thrust of innovation rather than a hindrance of business? And we're seeing this. I mean, we're seeing companies, entire companies. I mean, let's face it, Tesla is really a type of e-company unto itself. And I don't know the details on how well they're doing there, but hopefully they're doing well. I would say to our European friends and the companies I'm working with in Europe versus the United States, I'm seeing a similarity. I'm seeing a global similarity because that goes to Australia too, where they're very concerned over the last couple of years around environment, specifically because of the fires and because of how badly that affects Sydney and so on. And so this is a common global concern that's coming together. And I hope it's a trend that frankly promotes a renewed form of capitalism and promotion of finding innovative solutions to each of the E, S, and G. Well, the E and S are the real ones we're focusing on for the most part today.
Yeah, and then to your point, there is the awareness piece, right? The discussion that may already be taking place. Elaine, as you said, you're seeing that this discussion is becoming much more prominent. And you've talked about already how can people within a board position already start to build the competencies. I'm not sure, as sort of a final remark, Elaine, if there's anything you want to add on to that, and I'd like to go around the group and get a final remark on what is the one important takeaway that people can take from this conversation in your perspective.
Well, I think when you're a non-executive director on a board, your obligation is to make sure that you are helping the company to look ahead. What are the opportunities for the company? What are the threats that are coming? Are they well positioned to be able to do that? And that comes back to asking the right questions of management and supporting management. Are there the skills and capabilities in the management team to adapt to change and to address the issues that are coming at companies? Not around the board table, yes, but also in the management team, and how are they measuring, tracking, and rewarding delivery of good performance against those items. It really does matter, and it's hard. I think the other thing for non-executive directors, to keep in mind is to, yes, have this long view and demand rigor, but it takes time to develop the robust kinds of programs and reporting and capability that Newmont has, for example, today. And so, you have to invest over time in the right people and the right systems and setting targets.
Great, thanks. And Steve, maybe on the back of that, one thing you'd like to leave the audience with.
So I guess what I would say is that, I think many of us have recognized that the EU has been a bit ahead in this, and we would go and have conversations with investors, and you would really get very different kinds of questions, very much focused on these ESG issues. But I have to say that this year we have really noticed how much attention our US investors are paying to these issues. They are deep diving into our sustainability report. We are getting very detailed questions on the data. And I think what it tells us is that not only from a board perspective, but as executives who are engaging with shareholders, we really have to make sure that we are across these issues and we understand them well, because that is the expectation when we go into these meetings, that we're able to talk to these things effectively, and not just the sustainability people, but across the leaders of the organization. And I think that's just increasingly important, and we are seeing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, two things there, right, is, having the right information, having data to back up what you're seeing, to be able to monitor these trends in, real time, over time. Byron, any last thing to add?
Sure. I would, the diversity thing is, I believe, very important because it's an aspect of driving innovation. As diversity enters into our companies more holistically, what we are seeing is a more interesting environment for doing business. And that drives innovation and creativity. I was on with a fascinating person yesterday, Aisha Evans, who had a company called Zoox that is now a part of Amazon. I encourage everyone to look at what's going on there. It's fascinating to see her story. That's an example of quintessential ESG-oriented growth and development. And a couple little quick pointers is, one, I'm seeing that annual reports have actually become a lot more interesting. More companies they're examples of excellent reporting. Joan Connolly here at the corporate secretary here at NASDAQ has done a tremendous job of trying to make NASDAQ's annual report one that's an example for all listed companies. And then I'm seeing products come out to help this along. We've got a product called One Report that helps facilitate easing the burden of disclosure so that boards and IR and groups can be more focused on the core elements that particularly Elaine and Stephen and Paul were talking about for boards and for leaders that are trying to advance this down the this ESG component down the rail for us all.
Great. Yeah. So that brings up again, invest in the right competencies, invest in the right systems, as Elaine had said. And Paul, I see we're a little over time, but
I'll be really fast.
Yeah.
So the first is, don't let language get in your way. Sustainability issues are business issues, because your boards and executives' eyes may glaze over when you use some terms. So sustainability is business. We got a question in on what are the next big wake-up calls for the board.
Yeah.
Let me mention 4 areas that I think are going to be very important, just like the pandemic was, right? Okay, so water, biodiversity, international human rights, and then finally, stemming from the pandemic, the vaccine. Are you ready for all 4 of those things? So looking ahead to 2021, those are 4 areas I would focus on as emerging risks and opportunities.
Great. Yeah. And the human rights piece is very important, right? Because that also covers employee well-being, health and safety, which we're all seeing is, top of mind. Workforces, workplaces are evolved. Great. Well, I appreciate everyone who stayed on a little bit longer. We actually do have a final question for the audience. So that last poll gets to, specifically focusing on, we talked about the role of CFOs. I think we're seeing the biggest transformation in the role there. So from your standpoint, what should be the biggest priority for CFOs in 2021, thinking about, current risks and opportunities and some of those future risks and opportunities that we've been touching on. So you have 4 options there: digital transformation, investing in employee well-being, climate risk, and business continuity planning. For those of you that are still there and would like to respond. All right. So we've got responses coming in, and it's sort of, it's across the board we're seeing climate risk as the dominant. So, I think climate risk touches upon all of the issues that we've been talking about, right? That's the complexity of this landscape. They're all interconnected. But there's more to talk about. We'll definitely be following up with you with the report and some of the takeaways from this discussion. I really appreciate all of the expertise that you've shared. So thank you so much to Byron, to Steve, to Elaine, and to Paul. And thank you to the audience as well. For the questions we didn't address, we'll do our best to address them after the fact as well. But please feel free to get in touch in the meantime. All right, have a good rest of the day, a happy holidays, and a healthy new year.